Hello, everyone. I'm Major Garrett in Washington. Typically at this hour and from this desk, we report on and analyze politics. We rarely step aside for weather. Hurricane Milton is not weather. It is a serious, serious storm. It is currently barreling across the Gulf of Mexico. You look on the screen, that's where it is right now. Milton is sent to hit central Florida. We don't know precisely where in just a few hours. Florida already feeling the effects of this storm's outer bands. Massive rain, wind, all of this hitting Florida's western coast. Among the things officials are afraid of, in addition to wind and rain, storm surge. We don't know how high that storm surge will be, 6 feet, 10 feet. There are suggestions it could be as much as 15 feet high. Tens of thousands, if not hundreds of thousands of Floridians have already fled the projected path. State and local officials, having exhausted themselves and issuing evacuation warnings, have now told those who've decided to hunker down to prepare for life-threatening conditions. As you might expect, President Biden has been briefed on the storm. We expect to hear from the president this hour on federal preparations and response. We will bring you those remarks live when they happen. In the meantime, here is what we have already heard from state, local, and federal officials.
There is high confidence that this hurricane is going to pack a major, major punch and do an awful lot of damage.
Hurricane Milton is going to be a deadly and catastrophic storm.
If you're, for lack of a better word, dumb enough to think you can ride it out, write your name and a next of kin phone number on your arm or something with a Sharpie, so that when we come retrieve you the next day, we know who to call.
We start tonight with Jonathan Vigliotti, who joins us from Tampa, Florida. Jonathan, I can barely see you. I hope you're doing all right. Catch us up on what you are experiencing there in Tampa.
Yeah, good evening to you, Major. We were actually reporting earlier from the Bay Area, but had to retreat from that water because of flash flooding. You could see the rain, this band really whipping here. High winds, already 4 inches of rain have fallen. And we're expecting upwards of 18 inches. You can see as they're wiping off our lens. That's going to probably be happening throughout this report. The rain coming down, going to pick up significantly. We're still hours away from landfall. The time to evacuate has expired. Those that have chosen to stay put are now going to be riding out a storm that the mayor here in Tampa has described as unsurvivable. There are a number of threats. The first one, obviously, storm surge. In some areas, we're being told here in the Tampa Bay area as much as 12 to 15 feet, as you mentioned. Then, of course, the hurricane force winds and the flash flooding that we have already experienced. It's going to be a very difficult process. I think one of the biggest concerns from what we have seen here is just all the debris from Hurricane Helene 2 weeks ago. This was a community that was literally cleaning up from that storm when it had to put everything down to evacuate. So now you've got all this high wind. It doesn't take a lot of it to push all that debris, making it deadly projectiles. You have thousands of first responders that have come here to the region. You have more than 24 search and rescue teams that are staged here in Tampa. They're going to be sheltering in place through this hurricane, meaning if there is an emergency call, they will not be able to respond until after Hurricane Milton passes. Then you have also the response to power. We're being told 50,000 line crews are being brought here to the state from as far west as California. Officials are warning that the power could be out in some places for several weeks before that power is turned back on, Major.
And Jonathan, are there places there for people to stay, meaning shelters or some kind of place other than their residence if they so seek that?
And that's a great point, and that is one that Governor DeSantis in a press conference earlier today, when there was still time to evacuate to higher ground, made. Because now it is too dangerous to go to great distances to escape this storm. But there are shelters set up throughout the Tampa area that residents can access. If you are living in a low-lying area here along the coast, if you have a one-story home especially, you need to evacuate. You can still do so safely in short distances. You're not going to want to wait until 2 hours from now when the brunt of Milton really starts to bear down.
And we can see some minor vehicular traffic behind you, Jonathan. As always, stay safe, you and your crew. Thank you so much for joining us. Much appreciated, Jonathan Vigliotti in Tampa. CBS News meteorologist David Yeomans joins us now. David, you've been guiding our audience all day expertly through this storm. Catch us up on what you're seeing and what you believe we should anticipate in the next couple of hours.
The storm's eye, if you missed this earlier, is just 45 miles off the coast of Sarasota, piling water over the barrier islands. Storm surge flooding now penetrating far inland as well. The storm is still moving northeastward directly toward Tampa Bay. It is expected to take a bit of a right turn shortly, which would put the most likely landfall location right over Sarasota, Florida. That's most likely this evening, Eastern time, between 8 p.m. and midnight tonight. In those areas, conditions will deteriorate rapidly as the core of the eye wall around the clear eye in the center of the storm approaches. Winds in these coastal communities will easily gust over 110 miles per hour.
From your vantage point, understanding these storms, David, what's the most dangerous component part, not only as it makes landfall, but as it moves across the state?
Well, it's actually not wind in these storms, Major, that's the major killer. It is water. Both storm surge flooding in coastal communities, the rise of the ocean that overtakes people's first or second floors of their homes, but also freshwater flooding. This storm is fast moving, so we're going to have hurricane force winds across the Florida peninsula from Tampa to Orlando, all the way to the East Coast and Daytona Beach. Also in these inland areas, up to 1.5 feet of rain is possible, leading to another rare high risk of flash flooding diagnosed by the National Weather Service. Unfortunately, these high risk days only come around about once a month, but they lead to more than 1/3 of all flood-related fatalities. This is the same risk that we saw, Major, just 2 weeks ago in North Carolina from Hurricane Helene.
And David, very quickly, there have been reports today of lots of tornadoes spinning off even as the storm approaches. How big a risk is that?
Tornadoes are a huge risk, and of course you don't have as much warning with a tornado as you do with this hurricane, which we've seen coming for several days. Most of the Florida peninsula, at least from Tampa and Orlando southward, is under a tornado watch through the night tonight. Hurricanes produce tornadoes frequently as they make landfall due to the pre-existing spin that's already in the atmosphere. So far, as of a few minutes ago, Major, we've had 14 reported tornadoes, and that count is increasing by the minute.
David Yeomans, thank you very much. Scott McFarland joins us now from the White House. Scott, summarize what you've heard today and the federal preparation and response.
Major, it is unique and noteworthy how much time and energy was spent in the administration at the White House today simply pushing back on the misinformation and the toxic wave of conspiracy theories that have circulated around Hurricane Helene and forthcoming Hurricane Milton. It's the president himself, it was the White House press secretary, the FEMA administrator, all taking time today to try to push back on these theories that, first of all, that the government controls the weather, that FEMA is somehow an operation trying to seize land in hurricane zones, and all the other things that go into this conspiracy theory that the government rerouted disaster money to help undocumented migrants. All of that provably false, but all of that was part of the White House's day today. Haven't seen that before as an administration has to prep for a hurricane. Take a listen to just some of it from earlier today.
There's been a reckless, irresponsible, and relentless promotion of disinformation and outright lies that are disturbing people. It's undermining confidence in the incredible rescue and recovery work that has already been taken and will continue to be taken. And it's harmful to those who need help the most.
It's intentional to create distrust, and that level of distrust is, as the president said earlier today, un-American. And what we need to do is make sure people can get the assistance that they need and they deserve.
On that projection screen coming from North Carolina was the FEMA administrator. There are any number of consequences, Major, to this type of disinformation during a national emergency, but I think the primary one, echoed by members of the White House team today, is that they don't want this to get in the way of people evacuating. They want people to have faith and trust in what the government is saying about the danger of Milton and to get out of there.
And also, it's worth noting at this present time, Scott, unless you're on the eastern part of Florida, the time to evacuate on the western part of Florida has passed. You need to hunker down and stay where you are, as David Yeomans just summarized and Jonathan Vigliotti shared with us just a moment ago. As for the preparations, how did the White House describe what it's put in place?
Yeah, they count things, in gallons and liters and in boxes and cartons, all the water they've gotten ready, all the emergency supplies they've gotten ready. But also they're doing this with a dual mission, obviously. They also have to continue their efforts to help Helene in western North Carolina, getting supplies there. All of this also is happening in the backdrop of a funding need for FEMA. They insist they have enough money to get through these two hurricanes, but that they are in one of those precarious positions until Congress appropriates more money, where they may be at risk of having to pause some of the longer-term projects they have underway elsewhere in the country. That tends to happen at the end of fiscal years in Septembers and Octobers, but this is going to be a paramount issue, getting them more money when Congress returns here in mid-November.
Part of the to-do list after the election. Scott McFarland at the White House, thank you very much. Nearly 2,000 Florida gas stations say they have already run out of fuel. Hurricane Milton could make things more complicated in the hours and days ahead, and that's putting it mildly. Here to discuss that and other topics related to Milton and energy, U.S. Secretary of Energy Jennifer Granholm. Madam Secretary, great to see you as always. Talk to my audience about the fuel in Florida and what can or will be done to make sure people have it if they need it.
Yeah, the current situation is that there is enough fuel, but it's more sporadic because there has been a run on gas stations, understandably, and people who are trying to top off and get out of town. Now that we're in a situation where you have to shelter in place, access to fuel in the immediate won't be as much of an issue. The governor has been moving fuel, and fuel has been coming in through the ports. The ports now have been closed, but once the storm is passed, obviously the damage has to be assessed at the ports, but that form of entry will continue, as well as the trucks, assuming that the lanes remain open. So the fuel situation right now is not as much as urgent as it was, I will say, 12 hours ago when people were all trying to get out. I will say also that there has been an effort to make it easy for people who don't have access to fuel to be able to get to shelters. There's been an effort to use Uber. The state has created free Uber access if people are in their homes and still need to get to a shelter. And the final thing, I just want to underscore one of the things that one of your previous guests just said, which is even though it's too late to evacuate the state, but there is yet just maybe an hour while people can get to close by shelters, and people can get into those shelters, and often they're just like 10 miles, 20 miles away, just out of the eye of the storm. So we're still encouraging people who may still be hanging on to get to those shelters if they haven't already, but the fuel issue should be less of an issue.
And Madam Secretary, what can you tell us about power companies, how they're pre-positioned, who's coming to be there, and what will be done after the storm has passed to get the power back on?
Garrett, this is an amazing part of the American story, which is that there is a mutual assistance, a mutual aid compact among utilities across the country. There are, right now, the latest number I have is 40 states have contributed, 40 utilities in 40 states are contributing personnel to go to Florida and pre-position themselves, and Canada as well is sending personnel from the utilities to be able to help restore once the storm is through. They are pre-positioned right now, either in or around Florida, waiting for the worst to go through so that they can get in there and quickly restore. And one other thing that people need to know, Florida really is very good at this. We expect there'll be millions of people without power, but Florida and Florida utilities have really done an amazing job at trying to harden their grid. So almost half of their distribution lines, for example, their grid lines, are underground right now. And that is a good way to make sure that they're not obviously whipped around in high winds. And that's an aspect of hardening that's very important. So hopefully with all of the prep work that has taken for decades, they've been undergrounding, that it will be less than it otherwise would have been, the impacts. But it will still be, believe me, millions of people will be without power. And there are tens of thousands of people who are waiting to help.
Madam Secretary, tell my audience what's happening with power in North Carolina and Georgia, because they are still suffering, still reeling from the effects of Helene. Milton is front and center in Florida, but there are still folks who need power and other assistance in North Carolina and Georgia.
That's correct. Even as we're pre-positioning for Milton, we still have thousands of people who are assisting in the recovery efforts in the Carolinas and in Georgia. About 96-97% of the power from Helene has been restored. That remaining bit is all about the most difficult to restore areas where power was completely wiped out, where there is no foundation to just put up a pole again, where you've really got to go in and rebuild. And so that effort is ongoing and will continue to go on. Note that the president has deployed about 1,500 National Guard troops to the states that are affected to really help move the heavy debris and the cutting through the trees that have come down, et cetera. They may have to, those states, there may be a necessity to rebuild substations. That takes time to be able to do that. So the hardest and the most remote communities that haven't had an experience with hurricanes before and therefore hadn't had hardened infrastructure, those are the ones that will take some time to rebuild.
Energy Secretary Jennifer Granholm. Madam Secretary, thank you very much for your time.
You bet, Garrett. Thanks, Sue.
Hurricane Milton is expected to make landfall, as we said, in the coming hours. The storm has already started lashing Florida with tornadoes, strong winds, and rain. EarthCam is showing the conditions right now, as you can see, in Naples, Florida. We're continuing to track the latest on Milton. You're streaming CBS News 24/7. Welcome back to our continuing coverage of Hurricane Milton. The storm is expected to make landfall possibly around 9 p.m. Eastern, give or take. Sarasota, the most likely landfall location, although Tampa and St. Petersburg remain in some manner of jeopardy, and that's putting it mildly. It is still a Category 3 storm. That means it is packing winds of about 120 miles per hour. The impacts, varied as they are, of Hurricane Milton, well, they're already being felt on the ground. This tornado, as you can see, spotted in Pembroke Pine, Florida, near Fort Lauderdale on the state's east coast. Many, many tornadoes have already been spotted. I want to bring in Kimberly Guy, who is the co-chief operating officer for Baycare Health System. The organization has made available 2 of its properties to help with hurricane response. So, Kimberly, this is a moment where things are changing by the moment. What are you hearing? What are you preparing for?
Well, we're preparing for the worst. We're the largest healthcare provider in West Central Florida with 32,000 team members and 16 hospitals, including a pediatric and adult trauma center that we never evacuate and won't flood. So our biggest commitment is to serve this community, and we need to make sure that we have our team ready in-house to serve those that need our healthcare services.
How do you handle the logistics of that, Kimberly? Is everyone basically at those places and ready for whatever comes in the door?
They are. We actually have a storm team and a recovery team. So we have 2 shifts of team who work a 12-hour shift in-house at the beginning of the storm. We call them in. We shelter them, provide food and lodging. And then when we are safe to recover, we send in the recovery team and they replace that team so that we have uninterrupted care the entire time.
You've been through storms before. What are the most typical either injuries or necessities you meet when people come to you seeking care after a storm?
After a storm, I would say one of the most common is injuries where they've tried to cut down a tree, they've fallen off a roof, some type of trauma from those things when they try to do their own cleanup, perhaps accidents based on debris in the road. Those are pretty much the common reasons they'll come to the healthcare system.
Well, picking up on what you just mentioned, debris in the road, I don't need to tell you this particular part of Florida has debris on the streets in many neighborhoods right now because of Hurricane Helene. That debris is going to turn into one of 2 things. If there's a huge storm surge, it's just going to be part of the sea of things moving around, jeopardizing people who might find themselves momentarily trapped in the water, or before that, whipped up by the winds and turned into projectiles. Does that add to your range of potential dangers for those who might seek your assistance?
It absolutely does. You've articulated that incredibly well. I think the other important factor is our team just went through a really difficult hurricane and the impact of that. And despite that, they're incredibly resilient. They're back at the table ready to serve again. But we do hope that most of that debris got picked up, but it was a pretty short window for us and turnaround for this storm.
Oftentimes in situations like this, there is a request for blood donations. Do you have enough blood or things like that? Do you have all the basics you need for what you think is coming your way in the next, let's say, week or so?
We do. That's part of our preparation. We actually oversupply, bring in stock, making sure that we'll have access, because sometimes you don't have that information, the material access right away after the storm, again, due to debris, down lines, down trees, et cetera, and flooding. So we actually stock up so that we have the supplies that we need. And then we work with our local community providers on things like blood when we need that extra call for help.
Good luck to your team and to the work ahead. Kimberly Guy, thank you very, very much.
Thank you.
I did not plan on staying for this one. It scared the daylights out of me.
State and local officials warn that if you haven't evacuated, well, you're too late, particularly if you're in the western part of Florida. We are tracking the latest as the outer bands of Hurricane Milton bring wind, rain, and eventually storm surge. You're streaming CBS News 24/7. Picking up now from that CBS News special report, I'm Major Garrett in Washington. As you just heard, President Biden delivered remarks on Hurricane Milton as it moves toward Florida. He said the storm is expected to be one of the worst and most destructive this nation has seen in decades, if not longer. The president also made clear the federal government is ready to respond to the destruction that comes from Milton, whatever it might be. He also described misinformation about Milton and Hurricane Helene, which preceded it, as, quote, un-American, specifically name-checking former President Trump. Manny Bajorquez rejoins us now from Orlando. Manny, please forgive me. I'm sorry I had to interrupt you before. Please describe what's going on in Orlando and what they're bracing for.
Yeah, no worries about the interruption. Here on the ground in Orlando, we are still awaiting the worst of the hurricane, but already getting bands of rain that are raising concerns about what is forecast to hit this area. Maybe not the storm surge that's going to hit the West Coast, but the amount of rainfall is still set to cause flash flooding here in Orlando. And also the winds could topple trees and power lines. So they're telling people to expect prolonged power outages. It's going to be a long night here for what has already been a long day as people try to do those last-minute preparations and evacuations. Already, the airport here ceased operations for commercial travel at 8 this morning. The major theme parks have closed now and likely will be closed all day tomorrow. And the dynamic you have playing out here in Orlando is that not only do you have the residents here who are hunkering down, trying to get away from flood-prone areas, you have potentially visitors who couldn't get home who are now having to find a hotel, but also evacuees from the west coast of Florida who rode out Helene the last time, got a little concerned about what this one could bring and said, we're not going to ride it out this time. So they're all in this area as well. So yes, they may avoid the storm surge, but because it's still expected to be a hurricane when it hits this area, they're not going to avoid all the impacts.
Manuel Bajorquez, thank you for that excellent summary. We really appreciate it. Hurricane Milton could now make landfall in central Florida soon as 9 p.m. Eastern, maybe 9:30. We're tracking the Category 3 storm, and we will have the latest on its movements and possible implications soon. That's next on CBS News 24/7.
We are not going to put our first responders' lives in jeopardy because you made a poor choice.
That is called compound error avoidance. Welcome back to our continuing breaking news coverage of Hurricane Milton. With this message conveyed by local authorities across the area most likely to be hit by the hurricane, if you haven't evacuated, it's too late. For residents who stayed behind, well, tonight is going to be a fight for a lot of things, possibly their lives. I want to bring in Jeff Masters. He's a scientist and formerly worked with the National Oceanic and Atmospheric Administration's hurricane hunters. Jeff, it's great to have you with us. Summarize for the audience what is unique about this storm, and if they hear the terminology that it's weakening, why this storm is still quite dangerous.
We have to remember that some of the biggest catastrophes in hurricane history were from weakening storms. Katrina was weakening as it was approaching the shore, and it caused $190 billion in damage. It was a Cat 3 at landfall, and it was formerly a Cat 5. Well, here we have another former Cat 5, going to be a Cat 3 at landfall. And the storm surge is baked in. It's going to come ashore. It's going to be 8 to 13 feet along an 80-mile stretch of very heavily populated coast. So it's going to do unprecedented damage for this part of Florida. We've never seen a storm this strong over portions of, say, Sarasota, Venice. Another thing that makes it exceptional is the tornadoes it's causing. Over on the east coast of Florida, the tornado outbreak going on today is just unprecedented. Over 20 tornado reports so far, logged by NOAA, and some of the damage we're seeing is just the kind of stuff you'd see in the Midwest.
And Jeff, the ground is, in many parts, already saturated. Explain to the audience how that complicates and makes things more dangerous.
When you have saturated ground, it makes trees more likely to uproot and more likely to cause power outages. Also, when the rain falls on saturated ground, it's not going to soak in there. It's going to run off into the rivers right away, cause river flooding and flash flooding as well. So this is a very dangerous flood situation. NOAA has put out their highest risk for severe flooding from this hurricane.
How worried are you about those who've decided to ride this out?
Yeah, I certainly am worried because the number one danger from a hurricane is the storm surge. That's where we see the most deaths. Back 2 years ago in Hurricane Ian, we had, dozens of deaths from the storm surge. And I worry that we may see that as well from the people who chose to ride this one out.
And for the Tampa-St. Pete area, it is, as I understand it, Jeff, sea level and densely populated, which complicates both the things you just described. There's not much of a shelf, and there's a lot of people there and a lot of property.
Yeah, it's the most vulnerable place in the entire U.S. for a storm surge, both because they got over 3.5 million people there and because it's on this funnel-shaped bay where the storm surge can go in and concentrate.
Jeff Masters, thank you very much for your expertise and your time. That does it for me today. The Daily Report with John Dickerson picks up our continuing live breaking news coverage of Hurricane Milton.